According to multiple sources close to Middle Eastern diplomatic circles and Western intelligence structures, the situation inside Iran is rapidly deteriorating and is already going beyond the familiar cycles of unrest for the country. These are described as the most extensive and violent protests in decades, which analysts say for the first time in a long while have genuinely put the very survival of the Islamic regime at risk. The protests are no longer confined to individual cities, but have spread across entire regions of the country, and in a number of cases, demonstrators are effectively taking control of administrative centers, pushing out security forces. According to eyewitness accounts and human rights organizations, the authorities have lost operational control in several provinces, while the internet has been almost completely shut down nationwide to prevent information leaks and coordination among protesters. At the same time, Iran's economy is in a state of deep collapse. The national currency is rapidly depreciating, inflation is spiraling out of control, the banking system is operating intermittently, and fuel and food supplies in some areas are already accompanied by chaos and panic. Closed analytical reports that, according to insiders, are now circulating in Washington state bluntly that the Iranian regime is closer to a point of no return than at any time since the Islamic Revolution. Against this backdrop, sources claim that Donald Trump has practically made up his mind to launch a military operation against Iran, viewing it not as a classic war, but as a final push intended to collapse an already weakened regime. According to insiders within the American establishment, the logic of the White House is straightforward. If the regime is already cracking under the pressure of internal protests, precision strikes against key military and infrastructure targets could trigger a chain reaction leading to its downfall without the need for a prolonged ground operation. U.S. forces in the region, according to sources, are on heightened combat readiness, and the Pentagon has already worked through several scenarios for a rapid strike using aviation, missile systems, and cyber operations. However, insiders emphasize that there is a key factor that has so far restrained the U.S. from an immediate attack, and that factor is China. Beijing is one of Iran's most important allies, primarily in economic and strategic terms. According to confidential sources, China has sharply increased its support for Tehran in recent months, transferring weapons and military equipment worth billions of dollars, strengthening air defense systems, supplying electronic warfare technologies, and providing Iran with access to satellite intelligence. In effect, sources claim China is preparing Iran for a possible conflict with the US, but doing so as discreetly as possible, avoiding direct confrontation and official statements. Beijing's main interest in this situation is highly pragmatic: resources. Iran remains one of the key oil suppliers for the Chinese economy, with a significant share of these supplies conducted through gray and semi-legal schemes that allow China to bypass Western sanctions. Losing Iran as a supplier would be a serious blow for Beijing, capable of destabilizing the country's energy balance and undermining economic growth. That is why, according to insiders, China is prepared to fight for the survival of the Iranian regime, but not through a direct military clash with the US. Beijing's strategy is different. If Washington does decide to strike, China's goal is to ensure that Iran holds out, does not collapse in the first weeks, and turns the American operation into a long, exhausting conflict. In such a scenario, the US would be forced to become bogged down in the Middle East, expending resources, political attention, and military capacity, while China could continue receiving oil, strengthening its positions in Asia, Africa, and the Arctic, and expanding its influence in other regions of the world. In essence, as analysts note, Beijing views Iran as a strategic anchor meant to keep the US in a state of constant overload. At the same time, China clearly understands that a direct confrontation with the United States at this stage would be unprofitable and dangerous, which is why all support for Iran is being structured around the principle of war by proxy. As a result, the world has found itself at a point where several crises converge at once: Iran's internal collapse, US readiness for a force-based scenario, and China's covert but extremely active maneuvering. Everything will depend on whether Donald Trump has the resolve to move from pressure to strikes, or whether the Iranian regime will collapse under the weight of its own internal contradictions before the first American shell reaches its target. Which of these scenarios will materialize will become clear in the near future, but it is already evident that the consequences of either outcome will extend far beyond Iran and become part of a much larger redistribution of the global balance of power. Amid this backdrop, closed analytical centers are increasingly describing Iran as a key convergence point for multiple global tension lines, where any abrupt move in the region could trigger a chain reaction comparable in impact to the major crises of the late 20th century. According to sources familiar with Western intelligence assessments, the atmosphere inside the Iranian leadership is currently that of a besieged fortress. The elites are divided, parts of the security apparatus are overstretched, suppressing protests, and the loyalty of certain units is increasingly in question. For this reason, the regime is focusing less on restoring domestic control and more on projecting external resilience and readiness to confront the US, calculating that the threat of external aggression can temporarily unify segments of the population and justify further tightening of repression. At the same time, insiders note, the Iranian leadership fully understands that without external support, it may not withstand even a limited US strike, which is where China's role becomes critically important. According to sources, Beijing is acting on multiple fronts. In addition to arms deliveries and intelligence support, China is actively helping Iran establish alternative financial and logistical channels that allow it to bypass sanctions even in the event of war. This includes covert payment schemes for oil, the use of third countries, and expansion of infrastructure that preserves energy exports even if ports and terminals are partially destroyed. For China, this is not merely support for an ally, but an investment in the strategic resilience of its entire energy system. Beijing operates under the assumption that if Iran can hold out long enough, the US will face the same scenario that has repeatedly undermined American strategy in the Middle East: rapid military success without political outcomes, followed by prolonged instability and rising anti-American sentiment across the region. In such a case, Washington will either have to escalate its presence and resources or find an exit from the conflict that will appear as a concession. Both options, according to Chinese strategists, favor Beijing as they weaken US global positions and reduce its ability to respond simultaneously to challenges in Asia and Europe. This is why insiders emphasize China has no interest in a lightning victory for Iran or in its total collapse, but aims for a scenario of controlled resistance in which the conflict remains localized yet prolonged. Washington fully understands this, which, according to insiders, makes the decision to launch an attack so fraught. Any strike on Iran automatically becomes not only a matter of US-Iran relations, but also a component of a much broader game with China, where every move is assessed in terms of the global balance of power. Donald Trump, sources say, recognizes that a military operation could go down in history as a decisive blow against a hostile regime, but it could also mark the beginning of a period of strategic attrition for the US. In this sense, Iran becomes a test of the limits of American power in a world that is no longer unipolar. This is why, analysts believe, the coming weeks will be critical. They will reveal whether Washington is willing to risk for a quick outcome or will prefer to observe as internal protests and external pressure gradually weaken the Iranian regime on their own. Whatever path is chosen, one thing is clear: the consequences of this decision will be felt far beyond the Middle East and will become part of a new era of global competition, where every regional conflict inevitably becomes a component of the larger world game.